The demonstration had already ended. Los Angeles, California. A community martial arts center in the western part of the city. Late autumn, 1967. A Tuesday evening that had drawn a modest crowd. Folding chairs arranged in loose rows. Local instructors demonstrating their styles to an audience of students, practitioners, and curious visitors. Karate, Judo, Aikido, Tang Soo Do. Each instructor taking their turn on the polished hardwood floor. By 9 in the evening, the crowd had thinned. Most people had collected their coats and left. A few remained. Senior students from the demonstrating schools. An older man in the corner reviewing notes. 2 practitioners talking quietly near the entrance. The organizer stacking chairs. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, the room settling back into ordinary silence. Near the back wall, sitting alone, was a man nobody had paid much attention to all evening. He had arrived early, taken a seat against the back wall, watched everything with quiet intensity. Small frame, dark clothing. He had not introduced himself to anyone, had not been introduced. He was simply present, observant, the way a man is when he has nothing to prove. He was Bruce Lee. He had come to watch, nothing more. He was in the city for a meeting and had heard about the demonstration. He valued seeing other practitioners, other approaches. It told him things that isolated training could not. The man who changed the evening entered through the main door at 9:15. He moved like someone accustomed to being noticed, and he was impossible not to notice. A large man, well over 6 feet, broad shoulders, the kind of physical presence that reorganizes a room simply by entering it. He wore a fitted athletic jacket over a dark shirt. His jaw was set. His eyes scanned the space with the confident appraisal of someone who has already decided what they think. His name was Raymond Park. He was a Hapkido master. 12 years of dedicated training. A school of his own. Students who competed in regional tournaments. A reputation built on legitimate skill and the absolute conviction that he understood combat. Not theoretically, practically. He had fought. He had trained fighters. He had tested technique against resistance. He believed in what he knew. He also believed in what he didn't know. And what he didn't know about Jeet Kune Do had been irritating him for months. He had heard the name. Bruce Lee, a Chinese instructor based in Los Angeles. Teaching something he called Jeet Kune Do. Rejecting classical forms, claiming traditional styles were too rigid, too patterned, too committed to aesthetics over function. People spoke about him with a reverence that Park found unearned. In Park's world, respect was demonstrated, not described. He approached the organizer, spoke in a low tone, asked if Bruce Lee was present. The organizer hesitated, then pointed carefully toward the back wall. Park turned, looked, assessed. He walked over. Bruce Lee watched him approach without moving, without shifting his posture, without any visible change of expression. He simply watched. Park stopped in front of him. "You're Bruce Lee." Lee looked up at him. "I am." Park sat down in the empty chair beside him. Not beside, in front of. Turned to face him. "I've heard about your methods. Your school. The things you say about traditional martial arts." Lee said nothing. He waited. "I've trained in Hapkido for 12 years," Park continued. "I run a school. I have students who compete. I believe in what I teach. I believe it's effective." He paused. Let the pause carry weight. "And I've been told that you don't." Lee's expression remained calm. "I believe Hapkido is a sophisticated system. I have respect for its foundation. But," Park's eyes narrowed slightly, "but sophistication and functionality are different things," Lee replied. "A system can be highly developed and still create limitations." Park tilted his head. "What limitations?" "Predictability," Lee said. "Systems create patterns. Patterns create expectations. And expectations, when they become assumptions, create blind spots." Park studied him. The man was smaller than he had imagined. Lighter. Nothing about his physical presence suggested the ability to back up what he was saying. And yet there was something in the way he sat, in the way he spoke, a stillness that was not passivity, more like compression, the way pressure builds inside something sealed. "Show me," Park said. Lee looked at him without surprise. "Why?" "Because I would rather see it than debate it," Park said. "Words describe martial arts. Only demonstration reveals it." Lee was quiet for a moment. Then he stood. They moved to the center of the floor. The few remaining people in the room noticed. Conversation stopped. The organizer, who had been stacking chairs, set one down and did not pick up another. A few people moved closer. Not crowding. Just repositioning. Nobody spoke. Park removed his jacket, folded it, set it on a nearby chair. He was even larger without it. The architecture of his body spoke clearly. This was not casual fitness. This was training applied consistently over years. He moved to the center of the floor and settled into a Hapkido stance. Not aggressive. Ready. The stance of someone who has stopped hundreds of attacks. Who understands leverage, redirection, control. Lee stood across from him. His stance was almost nothing. Feet apart. Weight balanced. Hands up but relaxed. It looked informal. Almost careless. Park observed it without comment. He moved forward. A slow advance. Measuring. He extended a controlled strike toward Lee's center line. Not his full speed. Just enough to gather information. Lee wasn't there. He had shifted. Minimal movement. The strike found air. Park reset. Extended again. Different angle. Lee moved again. Same economy. Just enough. Park's eyes narrowed. He tried a third time. Faster now. A combination. Controlled step forward. Lead hand strike. Rear hand follow. Lee slipped the first, redirected the second with a touch, so light it barely registered as contact. The rear hand was guided past his face with a brush of 2 fingers. Park stepped back. Reassessed. What he was encountering was not evasion. Not defensive technique. It was something he had no practiced counter for. Because it didn't present itself as something to counter. It was absence. Exact, calculated absence. He committed more fully. A sweeping technique. A Hapkido staple. High level. Designed to unbalance and control. Lee stepped inside it. The interior of Park's range, where the technique had no geometry left. And there, in that close space, Lee's hand touched Park's wrist. Not gripping. Just present. Redirecting. Park felt his own momentum bend. Not broken. Redirected. As if the technique had been accepted and then returned to him at an angle he hadn't chosen. He caught himself. Stepped back again. 5 seconds had passed. Park lowered his hand slightly. Not all the way. Just enough to signal that something had shifted in his thinking. You're not blocking, he said. No. You're not evading. Not exactly. Park exhaled slowly through his nose. Then what are you doing? Lee's response came without hesitation. I'm responding to what you decide before you commit. Your body announces your technique before your body executes it. The shift in your hips. The rotation in your shoulder. The change in your weight. These things happen before the technique arrives. I respond to those. Park absorbed this. You're reading the intention. I'm reading the preparation, Lee corrected. Intention is internal. Preparation is physical. Every trained technique has a setup. The more trained it is, the more consistent the setup. And consistency, at that level, becomes visible to someone who knows what to look for. Park looked down at his own hands. His own body. His 12 years of training had produced exactly what Lee was describing. Precision. Consistency. Automatic execution. The same setups. The same preparations. Every time. Thousands of repetitions. You're saying my training created the vulnerability, Park said. I'm saying all training creates patterns, Lee replied. And patterns, by definition, can be anticipated. The question is whether you've trained against someone who anticipates them. Most practitioners haven't. Because most opponents come from the same system, the same patterns, the same training background. Park was silent for a moment. The people watching were equally silent. What they were witnessing had moved past the physical exchange. This was deeper now. This was a conversation between 2 philosophies in the language that mattered. Reality. Try again, Park said. This time I want to use something different. Something less patterned. Lee nodded. Park came forward differently now. No system. No particular form. Just movement. Less trained. More improvised. He threw something that had no classical name because it wasn't classical. A raw, committed attack from his dominant side. Lee slipped it, but fractionally slower than before. The movement had less preparation. Less to read. Park's eyes registered this. He pressed. More improvised combinations. Less committed to form. More committed to finding openings. Lee moved through them, but they were closer now. The improvisation was stripping away the predictability, reducing the signal Lee was reading. After 30 seconds, Park stopped. He wasn't winded. He was thinking. Interesting, he said quietly. You felt it, Lee observed. When I stopped using clean technique, you had less to read. Less preparation. Less signal. Lee's expression was engaged now. Genuinely interested. Your 12 years of training is real. Your skill is real. but it has been refined almost entirely within classical form. When you step outside it, you lose some of your power and some of your precision. But you also become less readable. Park walked slowly to the edge of the floor, stood there, processing. So what's the answer? Abandon training? Become chaotic? The answer, Lee said, moving toward him, is that classical training is the beginning, not the destination. You drill patterns to internalize mechanics, to develop power, timing, structure. But then you have to learn to dissolve the pattern, to apply the mechanics without the preparation, without the setup, without the signal. Park turned to face him. Most instructors don't teach that. Most instructors don't know it exists, Lee replied, because they've never faced someone who could exploit what they've built. They train against students who train the same way. The pattern is never revealed as a liability because everyone shares the same pattern. One of the remaining observers, a senior student from one of the demonstrating schools, spoke up from the side. How do you train to dissolve the pattern? Lee turned toward him. You train against resistance that doesn't cooperate with your system. Practitioners from different styles, different sizes, different attributes. You find the places where your technique fails. And you ask why? Not to abandon the technique, but to understand its conditions, to know when it works, and more importantly, when it doesn't. Park crossed his arms. Not defensively, thoughtfully. You're saying most martial arts training is too insular. I'm saying any system becomes insular if it only tests itself against itself, Lee replied. A style that only sparred within its own school would believe it was effective until it encountered something external. The external encounter is essential, not comfortable, but essential. Park studied him. The physical encounter had ended. The intellectual one was still unfolding. And he was beginning to understand, the more important of the two. You took me apart in 5 seconds, Park said. Your technique gave me the opportunity, Lee replied. Another practitioner who had trained the way you trained would have given me nothing, would have fallen into the same patterns, would have given me the same signals. You were only readable because I was trained to read something your opponents had never thought to look for. Park nodded slowly. That's both complimentary and deeply unsettling. Good, Lee said. Unsettled people keep learning. They stood facing each other on the empty floor. The contrast between them was remarkable. Size, background, style, everything that should have separated them as practitioners. And yet something had been established between them. Not friendship, not rivalry. Something more valuable. Mutual understanding of what neither of them yet fully knew. Park reached into his jacket pocket, produced a card, extended it. My school is on Vermont Avenue. If you want to exchange ideas further. Lee took the card, looked at it, then produced one of his own. Mine is on College Street. They exchanged cards like two men who had read every page of the other's book and discovered they were both still in the middle chapters. Park looked at the card, then up at Lee. I came here tonight to prove something. I know. I didn't prove it. You proved something else, Lee said. That you're willing to question a foundation you spent 12 years building. That's more valuable than any technique. Park put the card in his pocket. He retrieved his jacket from the chair, pulled it on, looked around the room one final time. At the organizer who had stopped pretending to stack chairs. At the students who had watched the entire exchange in silence. At the ordinary space that had briefly held something extraordinary. He walked to the door, stopped, without turning. What would you call what happened tonight? Lee thought for a moment. Education. Park left. The room slowly returned to motion. The organizer resumed stacking chairs. The remaining observers began collecting their things. Conversation started again. Quiet. Reflective. Nothing loud enough to break the mood. Lee stood alone in the center of the floor for a moment. Then he walked back to his chair against the rear wall. Sat down. Returned to the stillness he had occupied all evening. As if nothing had happened. As if the quiet dismantling of a 12-year system was simply part of an ordinary Tuesday. Raymond Park drove home that night with something he had not arrived with. Not defeat. Defeat is clean. Finite. Easy to dismiss. What he carried was more persistent. A question. Not about Bruce Lee. About himself. About the 12 years. About the thousands of hours that had built something genuine and sophisticated and somehow simultaneously complete and insufficient. He returned to his school the next morning and watched his students training. Watched the preparations before the techniques. The setups. The signals. The patterns so deeply drilled they had become invisible to everyone who shared them. visible only to someone standing outside the system looking in. He called a senior student over. "I want to change how we spar," he said. "I want you to bring in people who don't train here. Different styles, different backgrounds. I want our students uncomfortable. I want them encountering things they haven't trained for." The student looked surprised. "Why?" Park looked at him for a long moment. "Because the only way to know if something works is to test it against something that doesn't want it to." He crossed the floor to the window, looked out at the morning street. In his pocket, still, a small card. Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute. Bruce Lee, instructor. He had come to prove that his art was superior, had encountered instead the most important lesson of his career. That superiority was not a destination. It was a direction, a constant movement towards something that remained permanently ahead, reachable only by those willing to accept that they had not yet arrived. The students continued training behind him. The sound of movement, of impact, of correction, of the ordinary machinery of martial arts instruction. Park watched them, and for the first time in 12 years, he watched as a student. Because the man who never stops learning is the only man who never stops growing.